So I already gave my whole spiel about the summary of the book at the back, where a lot of these books don't really tell you what the book is about. And I'm sure that's to not give away too much of the plot, but in fear of giving too much away, it doesn't really give you an idea of what it's about. It's about a family in Latin America, true, but I feel like it also has strong themes of plot, such as politics, communism, but the idea of Marxism and a lot of other ideologies going on in there, and a lot of rebellion, a lot of talk about freedom and fighting the government system and changing the government system. It's a lot about that in there too. Now, for the rest of my review, I'm just going to talk about various topics that I liked about the book rather than talking about the writing and the character development, because honestly, the writing was fine, the character development was fine. I have no qualms with that. Me as a book reviewer, I always like to talk about the themes a little bit more, so let's dive into that. The first thing I want to talk about is how the book talked about slavery in Latin America. It's not necessarily slavery, but the idea of servitude and it being basically the same as being a slave. Like, I think the idea of that is interesting because a lot of people try to pretend like African Americans were the only people that were enslaved throughout history, which is the furthest thing from the truth. So I think just looking into a glimpse of it, of like what it was like during that time for other people that weren't indeed black in other countries, was interesting. And it's like, yeah, the servants and stuff at Tres Marias got paid, but at the same time they weren't exactly treated fairly. And like, granted, Esteban kind of brags about how he's the best patron and he is the patron that treats his servants the kindest. And while it is true, it's still very far from fairness, I would say. Just because he's like, look, you have a place to sleep in, but the place is like a brick building with like nothing in there, you know? It's like one of those. So, or like, here, you have food to eat, but it's like slop. I think that honestly this book taught me more about like Latin American history than like I did in my education system, so that's interesting. And it did it within like a few days. Like, I didn't have to read a thick book, a thick textbook to like get what I needed to out of the experience. So the next topic that I want to talk about is misogyny and sexual misconduct in the book. It's very apparent in the story that Esteban is racist, something that majority of the female characters in the book ignore. Allende does have this aspect of feminism in her book that I think is nice because it doesn't come off as preachy, but it also doesn't come off as cheesy, because in today's day and age, a lot of people think feminism just means, oh, a strong girl character that can kick everyone's butt and she's physically strong. But I think this is nice just because a lot of the other female characters were strong in other capacities that weren't just physical. They were strong mentally, they were strong emotionally, and not just in the physical aspect of things. I'm not saying it's bad to have a physically strong female character, but it's overdone. And so it just makes me appreciate the fact that you have a strong female character that's strong in other ways. It's not just like, ooh, I have big muscles and I can punch you in the face. There were also moments where Esteban would say something and then that would be inherently like misogynistic and or hypocritical, and a lot of the women in the family would call him out for it, Blanca and Alba especially. But besides like calling him out for these things, he's never exactly challenged. There's no one that goes up to him and is like, you're wrong and here's why. Although granted, I could understand there were probably plenty of women that weren't necessarily brave or bold enough to do that in that time period, in that day and age. So to some extent, it holds true to like the realism aspect of like there's this stronghold woman that's like telling everybody off, and like she experiences no consequences for like doing that, because I've read some feminist books and I was just like, oh girl, this would not fly in the time period you're trying to write about it. I think it's good to fantasize that what if there was someone like this, but Esteban just kind of like went out throughout his daily life and he never seemed to, he changed into a more understanding person. Like, I think somewhere in the book, and I marked it, where he was like, he understands that there are some women that are intelligent and can make it in this world and have the same job as a man. But we were never like led up to that. Like, it was just kind of like, yeah, he's real sexist and he thinks women don't deserve the same rights as men, to like, oh yeah, women are smart now. And there was like nothing, like I feel like he didn't learn his lesson. It was just like, my eyes are opened, I see the light now. But there was nothing that like brought him to that. So the other aspect that I wanted to talk about was the sexual misconduct and or rape. So the book falls into a trope that a lot of other books of today's day and age fall into, and that's the aspect of using rape as a plot point, which is fine. However, 9 times out of 10, the female characters that are victims to this don't deal with their trauma properly. They either don't deal with the trauma or they don't talk about it in any sort of capacity. And that's what happened with a lot of women that experience this, especially Alba. Like, way at the end when she finally comes home, it's never talked about. And I'm guessing it's probably just because like we were literally on like the last like 10 pages. So there might have not been enough time to like go over the effects of what happened to her. But I feel like a lot of times the concepts of rape and sexual abuse is just hastily thrown into the book, and it's either done in a way that talks about everyone around the victim, especially when someone is trying to white knight the victim and be like, yeah, I'm gonna go out and just like beat up your abuser, mostly to make a certain character look better. But it's hardly ever shown like the victims and what they go through in terms of like trauma, in terms of like nightmares and paranoia and mistrust of other people or a certain gender, or just like all the things that go into that is never talked about. And I kind of it bothers me, to say the least, because a lot of times rape is just treated as a trope where it's like, oh, we have this character and we're just gonna make a bunch of terrible things happen to them. They got beat up and raped, and this happened, 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 and then also this other terrible thing happened, and then that happened. Like, it's just a hodgepodge of things that happen to a character, but the effects are never felt. And I just wish certain writers would treat sexual abuse with more like care than they do, and give it the proper attention that it deserves. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people that experience sexual abuse and they do like try to ignore it. They try not to talk about it. They don't feel the trauma of it, or try not to acknowledge the trauma of it. But it's different from like it doesn't happen to a character versus like the character completely ignoring it. It just sucks that you have this whole aspect of like a woman is sexually abused, and in the next span of a minute they've already moved past it and they're sucking it up, and they never like think or talk about it ever again. And I'm tired of it, honestly. So either way, this concept kind of dropped a star for me for the review. Although, granted, I will say, at the time period it was written, I'm sure rape was just like not a thing that was explored in writing and or talked about. It just wasn't necessarily a big concept at the time. And even now, it's considered somewhat bold to like, you know, write about it. But it, to some extent, it disappointed me just because I saw so many reviews praising this book about it, and I read it and was just like, okay. So I touched upon the aspect of feminism, but I want to kind of go back to it for a second. And there are 2 things that I really like about the way Allende writes her sort of feminist ideals, or just feminism in general, as like a theme in this book. And one is the fact of it's not written in a way that's preachy or really cheesy. So it's not written in a way, like I said earlier, that's like strong female girl, but that the characters are strong in other ways. I think that Allende is able to craft characters that are inherently sexist and pointing out the flaws and hypocrisy of sexism in a way that works, and in a way that's not necessarily like preachy, you know? Specifically for Esteban, in this sense, many women are like unbothered by his anger. He'll throw these temper tantrums and start smashing things and using unnecessary violence, and a lot of the women would be unbothered. They wouldn't really react. They're just like, oh, whatever. And I think that I appreciate that. Let's just say that I appreciate that, in a fact of like, they're not the sort of women that would like curl up and start crying and trembling in fear just because he's like breaking a table or something. They don't let him bother them. And in the same capacity, Esteban kind of has this desire to possess Clara. That even though they're married, like, she doesn't belong to him, so he tries to like win her affections in order to have some sense of like possessiveness over her, but it doesn't work. And throughout the book, he has a sense of like, she'll never be mine. And I think that's also done well, in the fact of like, Esteban has this idea that his wife is some sort of object that he needs to own, and is something that he can't achieve when it comes to Clara. Okay, so the other aspect that I want to try to explain to the best of my ability is actually this one scene that's probably not that important in the grand scheme of things, but me and my best friend did have like a great discussion about this. And it's the idea that Nevaeh Duval, Clara's mother, early on in the story, spends a lot of time trying to rally women to fight for their right to vote, pretty much. And during this time, she's going to a lot of factories where working women are employed at, and try to basically preach to them to fight for their rights and all this and that while they're working. The thing about this is that it's weird because Nevaeh Duval comes from a place of privilege where she has money. She's well off. And I think that... Ooh, let me scoot over. So she has money and she's well off. And I think that she's in a position where she'll always be taken care of. She'll always have money. She'll always be okay. Versus the women that she's trying to preach to are working women. They work every day for like minimum wage. Nevaeh has probably never really worked a day in her life. And there's this disconnect when it comes to that. Even when she goes to visit them, she has like these fur coats and like really nice designer clothing. And her and her friends are standing up on these soapboxes talking to them while they're like in the factory line working on whatever it is that they're working on. I don't remember if they said, but they're in the factory line and they're kind of like in these rags and whatever, and very like dirty-ish clothes, and they're not really giving her the time of day despite her having good intentions. I think that was just an interesting idea. And nowadays, in today's day and age, most of us call this sort of idea white feminism, but I think it points out the fact of like the disconnect when it comes to richer women and poor women both being feminists, but just like how they're perceived when it comes to someone who is below their social class. It's like when you have like a YouTuber, right? And you have those like prank channels that all of a sudden want to do like good, so they like start going to like the ghetto to like help homeless people and like giving homeless people like money or food or whatever, while they're like pulling up in their like really fancy cars or like their designer clothes and nice shoes and all this. It's off-putting. It just feels weird. And like, even though Nevaeh does have good intentions, it just makes the poor not really trust her as much. And I just thought that idea was interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments below, but it was an interesting discussion me and my friend had. So yeah, that little bit I wanted to like add in. So let's move on to my favorite topic in most books, the romance. So there's a lot of everybody's favorite trope, love at first sight, right? And it happens a lot in this book, more specifically with important characters such as Blanca and Tercero and Alba and Miguel. It's the idea that the minute they see each other, especially when they're children, they have this deep love where they're just meant to be and they're soulmates, and they don't express words, or they don't need reasons, or they don't need all of this. They just love each other, and that's it, and that's just how it is. And to some extent this worked on me just because it reminded me of Wuthering Heights, and goddamn do I love me some Wuthering Heights. But I also recognize that it's not everybody's cup of tea. Besides that, there's the whole intense childhood love that lasts in 2 generations of the family, the ones I just named. But however, as these characters get older, the love starts to fade, or it starts to get unnecessarily complicated. And I feel like this was no mistake by any chance. When they're children and even teenagers, it's simple and pure to some extent. But then as they get older, when it comes to committing with things like marriage and moving in together and having children and sharing a life together, there's always one party in the relationship that's very reluctant to do that, or is unwilling to do that, and is very non-committal. And I feel like Allende is trying to like make some sort of social commentary that I'm not catching on to about that, but I did notice it. I did pick up on it. So for example, there's Jamie and Amanda's love. They kind of have this like, the minute Jamie saw Amanda, he had a small crush on her, and it kind of grew. However, as they got older, they start to kind of distance themselves to each other, leaving room for wondering whether or not Jamie ever loved her in the first place. And I think it was Jamie, in my opinion, I feel like Jamie liked her so much just because she was forbidden, and not because she was so beautiful and starking. I think she appealed to him because she was dating at the time Nicholas, and because they were together, he wanted her more just because it was forbidden. And I feel like once her and like Nicholas split it off, they had this little bit where they were like flirting with each other and they were together. And then after that, Jamie was really happy. But then some time went by and like Amanda returned to him and was actually like, I really love you. But he didn't love her back. And he didn't tell her this, but he just pretended to go along with like the relationship, even though he knew in his heart that he didn't love her. But I feel like maybe he never really loved her in the first place. Maybe he just wanted her because it was like taboo, you know? It's possible. I don't know. It's just a theory. But it's interesting for me to think about that, like, hey, maybe he only wanted to be with her because she was dating Nicholas at the time. And like now that he actually has her, he's like not as interesting. Or she's not as interesting to him. Then there's Blanca and Tercero. So Blanca is afraid to commit to Tercero to the point where she's putting their relationship at a standstill for like years pretty much. And I think it's mostly just because her pride is in the way. Because she has some fear of moving in with him, and if she moves in with him and commits to Tercero, basically her social class changes. She's not, I don't know if she's considered, I guess she would be considered like higher class, right? So like really wealthy. But she would go from really wealthy to basically dirt poor just because of the way Tercero lives his life. And he even tried to accommodate for her. Like he moved from the slums to like a middle class apartment. But even then she was like, I don't like the apartment. It's way too small. I can't handle it. So I think to some extent Blanca is afraid of her class changing to where like she's not willing to compromise her wealth. Even to the point where like once Esteban cuts her off, she still doesn't want to live in a smaller house. Like she, even though she actually is poor, she doesn't want to feel like she's poor. And I think that might be her thing going on there. I don't know if it's right, but it's a possibility. And then something that both Testero and Miguel have in common is that they're both have these I cannot say the word. They have their beliefs that they stand hard for, and they have these political ideologies. There we go. That is a pillar of like what they stand for, what they believe in, and they fight for it to the point where it's more important to them than like their love for Blanca and Alba. And Miguel likes his freedom a lot more than he loves Alba, which is seen as like, I find it very admirable and realistic, and it works. And I feel like it makes them more human. However, this kind of leads us into a problem where Blanca and Alba are chalked up to these like lovesick puppies. That everything that they do is either motivated by their kindness or their love for their significant other. And I think that to some extent, yes, in a sense, there are people that would do crazy things in the name of love. However, it upsets me when the female characters are the ones that are only motivated for love, while the male characters have other things, other nobler reasons for doing the things that they do. And that bothers me. It bothers me. It doesn't bother me a lot, but it bothers me a little bit in the back of my heart. But in this case, it's almost like taking a step back from the feminism that I talked about earlier. So take that for what you will. Speaking of politics, but in hindsight, the politics that occurred in this book didn't mean much to anyone else besides the male characters. And the rest of the family was all just like victims of the war and the politics that was happening in the book. And for me, someone that didn't care about politics but found the history digestible enough for it to be entertaining and not like overbearing, like being in a history class, it worked. However, in the last 100 pages especially, I feel like it was rushed, especially when the coup d'etat and the dictatorship started. It was just like, oh yeah, and then like the government is overthrown, the president is killed, and now we're in a dictatorship. And that's the pace where it kind of happened. And first of all, it took me a minute to figure out what was going on, just because I feel like the pacing took a sharp left turn so quickly. But by the time I did realize what was going on, it didn't hit me as hard as I think Allende was hoping, just because I feel like the strategy here was to just show you how swiftly and how quickly the government changed, especially under this dictatorship, and how repressive it was, so you could get a sense that this happened so quickly, and to feel the overwhelmness and to feel the stress that all the citizens were going through, because even they didn't fully grasp what was happening. But I feel like to some extent it just caused confusion rather than the helplessness, the feeling of helplessness that Allende was trying to go for. But that's just my opinion. Maybe it works. Who knows? So this also took off another star from my review just from the last few pages of the pacing. And in this case, this would put my review at a whopping 3 stars. However, I decided to give it an extra 0.5 just because I feel like the entire story in and of itself has some special place in my heart that I don't know. I just feel a little bit attached to it, you know? But up next in my 2 review list is Persepolis and Persepolis 2. Let me hold them this way. Persepolis 1 and 2. And honestly, I don't really know what the book is about, because there's no, like, the little spiel at the back isn't there. So now I was like, maybe it's somewhere on the inside. It's not there either. So I guess I'm just going to have to read it and find out. But Persepolis is like more of a comic book. Like when it's closed, it looks like a book, but it's actually a comic book. And it looks really nice. But it's also like up to like 400, 500 pages. So I don't know how much of it I'll actually be able to get through. But yeah, look forward to that. Hello.
Hey, oh, it smells good in here.
Thanks. That's a jasmine candle.
Were you recording?
Yes. No, it's fine.
You can delete it, right?
Yeah, or I can like take this part out. No, it's fine.